The Problem of God, Answering a Skeptic's Challenges to Christianity by Mark Clark. Chapter 1, The Problem of Science. The trouble about argument is that it moves the whole struggle on the enemy's own ground. By the very act of arguing, you awaken the patient's reason, and once it is awake, who can foresee its result? C.S. Lewis, The Screwtape Letters. How often have we turned on the television and heard the host say, "Tonight we will be talking about faith versus science." Our first guest is a former University of Oxford professor, evolutionary biologist, and best-selling author. He believes that science, not faith, holds the answer to all questions. On the other side of the aisle, we have Joe Smith, who will speak for the legitimacy of faith in Christianity. Joe homeschools his kids, thinks Oprah is the Antichrist, and lives in a swamp. Something like this plays out every day on television, social media, and even university campuses across the Western world. Joe and the Oxford professor represent the widely embraced caricatures of the opposing sides of the faith-science debate. Christianity and faith in general is seen as naive, simplistic, and incompetent with human reason. It might have a place in a carefully isolated sphere of life, but science should occupy all of life. Science is based on truth and evidence, while faith is based on hopeful thinking and legend. Science is a search for objective evidence that leads humanity forward, while faith looks back to ancient teachings outmoded by holy books and irrational conclusions in the face of overwhelming evidence otherwise. Confronting the myth. The dichotomy between faith and science, however, is misguided. It is created by a culture that thinks only in sound bites and extremes. Rather than bothering to investigate the place where truth is usually found, in the both and, in this case, of faith and science working together, rather than the either-or choices presented to us time and time again, wherein the two are mutually exclusive. This is a cultural myth written and preached by one of the most powerful and pervasive structures of thought the world has ever known: secularism. Secularism teaches that because there is no God and no spiritual reality in the universe beyond what we can test, naturalism, beliefs in such ideas should be marginalized from public life and discourse. Secularists believe that religious beliefs have been categorically proven false by modern developments in science and technology, and they can now be dismissed. Secularism has held philosophical sway in Western culture since its ascent during the Enlightenment, 1600 to 1800 AD. Its modern form is represented most popularly by thinkers such as Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, and the late Christopher Hitchens. They argue that science and naturalistic evolution have provided enough evidence to deduce atheistic conclusions to all of our foundational questions, those of origins, meaning, morality, and destiny. Furthermore, they assert that people who don't submit themselves to a purely naturalistic outlook are primitive and irrational. Faith is like a mental illness, Richard Dawkins has said, a great cop-out, the excuse to evade the need to think and evaluate evidence. Sam Harris agrees, saying, "We have names for people who have many beliefs for which there is no rational justification. When their beliefs are extremely common, we call them religious. Otherwise, they are likely to be called mad, delusional, or psychotic." Notice the dichotomy. Science is about thinking, evidence, and rational justification, while Christianity and faith in general are about evading evidence and clinging to non-rationality. But what if secularism and naturalism are the views that are outdated? What if the worlds of faith and reason are not opposed to each other at all, but actually belong together in a beautiful and life-changing symmetry that makes sense of the evidence, even more than atheistic explanations do? That is precisely what I have come to see after years of examination. I have been led toward Christian faith by reason and the study of science, history, and philosophy, and away from a modern secular atheistic worldview. I have come to see that Christianity isn't a less rational worldview, spiritual versus logical, but a more rational one. The Plantinga effect. Such a conclusion is not mine alone, but is the experience of many of the academic disciplines of science, philosophy, and the like, which is a story we don't hear very often. For instance, a few years ago, Quinton Smith explored the way Christians were taking over philosophy departments in universities across America, warning his colleagues that the field of philosophy is being desecularized, a movement that came about largely because of the work of one man, Alvin Plantinga, a theist, one who believes in God, and a Christian who is considered by many to be the greatest living philosopher. Plantinga argues for the existence of God at such a high and convincing level that Smith says in philosophy it became, almost overnight, academically respectable to argue for theism. This trend is but one of a plethora of examples, including many occurring in the fields of history and science, where the walls that had separated faith from reason are climbing. And this resurgence in the credibility of theism is not occurring as the product of naive ignorance, but as the direct byproduct of reason and intelligent exploration by top thinkers in their respective fields. So much so, in fact, that the sentiment of many now reflects not a Dawkins-like derision of Christianity, but the opposite, a mockery of the misinformed tenets of atheism. Philosopher David Bentley Hart captures this fundamental shift well, saying, "I do not regard true philosophical atheism as an intellectual, valid, or even cogent position. In fact, I see it as a fundamentally irrational view of reality, which can be sustained only by a tragic absence of curiosity for a fervently resolute will to believe the absurd," concluding that atheism must be regarded as a superstition. The myth of the church versus science. Contrary to the popular narrative of our time that posits faith, and the church specifically, against science, the reality is the church has never been its enemy, and any disagreements between the two, which have of course existed at times, have been gravely exaggerated. When atheists speak of the church's persecution of scientists, for instance, they tell stories about people being burned at the stake for scientific theories that displace God, about Galileo, Copernicus, and Giordano Bruno being tortured for holding heliocentric views of the universe. Thrilling dramas, but untrue. Historian David Lindbergh, speaking about the medieval era wherein these supposed persecutions of science took place, writes, "There was no warfare between science and the church. Historians agree that science versus religion story is a 19th century fabrication. The church did not persecute Copernicus or Bruno or Galileo for scientific theories. As historian Thomas Kuhn puts it, Bruno was not executed for Copernicanism, but for a series of theological heresies centered on his view of the Trinity, a gruesome reality, but not one based on the conflict of religion and science." In fact, Galileo was a friend of the church for most of his life, a practicing Catholic. In 1616, he came to Rome and met with the Pope multiple times. As time went on, he did become more critical of the church and its views. The church did persecute Galileo for a time, demanding he recant some of his heliocentric views, but he was never charged with heresy and placed in a dungeon or tortured, as has become popular mythology among skeptics. He was sentenced to house arrest and then released into the custody of the Archbishop of Siena, who housed him for 5 months in his palace. Galileo then returned to his villa in Florence, continuing his scientific work and even publishing before dying of natural causes in 1642. The traditional picture of Galileo as a martyr of intellectual freedom is wrong. Any persecution he faced serves as an anomaly. Historian Thomas Leslie writes, a momentary break in the otherwise harmonious relationship that had existed between Christianity and science. Indeed, there is no other example in history of the Catholic Church condemning a scientific theory. Another modern example of this historical revisionism by skeptics is the history of the medieval church believing that the Bible taught a flat earth, and then reacting in outrage when science came along and proved that the Bible was wrong. This is simply not true. From the time of the ancient Greeks, people knew the earth was round. They observed that the hull of a ship sailing from shore disappears before the top of it, the mast, and would see the reflection of the earth on the moon during an eclipse. They saw the earth was round. The so-called flat earth conflict is simply part of 19th century propaganda. And so, Oxford professor Alistair McGrath concludes rightly, the idea that science and religion are in perpetual conflict is no longer taken seriously by any major historian of science. One of the last remaining bastions of atheism, which survived only at the popular level, namely the myth that an atheistic, fact-based science is permanently at war with a faith-based religion. The Garden of Christianity. It's not just that Christianity is not at war with science, but historians now acknowledge that the thing we presently call modern science was actually conceived and born and flourished in the matrix of Christian theism itself. Christian theology was the garden out of which modern science grew because it presented a world with distinct form, complexity, and design. The Christianity challenges us to experiment with what we see, believing there is order and uniformity to the universe. No other worldview, philosophy, or religion of the ancient world offers the unique perspective Christianity did. This is why modern science didn't emerge prior to the 17th century. The foundational philosophical thinking in many cultures inhibits progress toward a scientific outlook. Animism defies nature and claims there is a God in trees, water, and rocks. Such a worldview inhibits scientific investigation because one cannot subject defied objects to objective analysis. Buddhism says that the universe itself is an illusion, therefore there is no point in doing any kind of scientific inquiry, because all your conclusions are going to be an illusion as well. Polytheistic religions explain events by citing the actions of the gods, thus there is no point in an investigation. It is not necessary to ask why water bubbles up in the ocean because the answer is metaphysical. Poseidon is stirring it up. Though several great civilizations of the ancient world, Mesopotamia, India, China, Egypt, Greece, Rome, developed some significant technological advancements, these societies lacked the philosophical framework necessary to birth the experimental enterprise known as modern science. Christianity offered a number of fundamental variables and laid the groundwork for scientific inquiry. Kenneth Richard Samples cites 10 such variables. The physical universe has a distinct objective reality. The laws of nature exhibit order, patterns, and regularity. The laws of nature are uniform throughout the physical universe. The physical universe is intelligible. The world is good, valuable, and worthy of careful study. Because the world is not divine and therefore not a proper object of worship, it can be an object of rational study. Human beings possess the ability to discover the universe's intelligibility. The free agency of the Creator makes the empirical method necessary. God encourages, even propels science through his imperative to humans to take dominion over nature and the intellectual virtues essential to carrying out the scientific enterprise are part of God's moral law. From these, science drew on the biblical mandate to use reason to explore and to investigate. In contrast, consider Judaism and Islam. They, for the most part, are worldviews that emphasize not reason so much as jurisprudence, the study and interpretation of law. In their case, the study of the Torah, the Mishnah, and the Quran. That is their rich history, but Christianity's history is in theology and philosophy. The heroes of Western Christianity are people who wrote and taught doctrine and creeds: the Apostle Paul, Thomas Aquinas, Augustine, John Calvin, and Jonathan Edwards. The popular picture of Christians being scared of science and deep thinking has simply never been true. In fact, the university itself is a 12th century Christian invention. Harvard, Princeton, Yale, Dartmouth, and Brown all began as Christian institutions. Detailed scientific and literary analysis has not only been an emphasis of Christianity since its inception, but Christianity had a part in their birth. Everyone has faith. But isn't faith blind belief? Isn't it something religious people have versus the rest of humanity, say atheists and agnostics, who believe in facts and evidence? Not at all. Everyone, even the most convinced atheist, has a faith position. Everyone believes in something and makes assumptions about reality that can't be proven, even through science. One might say, I don't believe in God. I follow where science and history lead us. Objectively, without a predetermined agenda, I don't have faith in anything. Such a person is not being honest with himself. Everything we believe is filtered through a grid, a worldview that has been adopted over time, constructed with a myriad of variables, where and when we were born, our family and education, media, etc. We are frequently unaware of these presuppositions, but we must see that all of them are, to a certain degree, faith-based conclusions rather than beliefs adopted through empirical proof. For instance, I recently read a story about a nurse who was a follower of Jesus. The doctors with whom she worked were adamant that the hospital was a purely secular place. In other words, there was no room for faith to play a role in caring for patients. One night, the staff was discussing a patient who was on life support and debating whether to take him off or not. One doctor said to another, well, at least we know if we do that we won't be suffering. He won't be suffering anymore. Everyone in the group nodded in agreement, but the nurse wondered to herself, how do you know this? That belief, the idea that the person would not be suffering anymore once he was dead, in and of itself is a metaphysical statement about what the afterlife is like. The group of doctors was speaking out of a faith position for which they had no proof. How did they know that the person wouldn't be suffering more than he was now? They believed this wholeheartedly, but based on what evidence? It is a faith position. Everyone has one. The problem is that many of us are blind to the everyday conclusions we draw without proof. Many of us are also blind to our own blindness. For instance, Harvard University biologist Richard Lewontin wrote an article published in the New York Review of Books in which he admitted that he and the scientists with whom he works prefer naturalistic and atheistic explanations for everything they study, which is itself no surprise. But what he wrote next was telling. The reason he prefers such explanations for things, he said, is because he and the scientific community have a prior commitment to materialism. It is not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, that we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes. We cannot allow a divine foot in the door. What Lewontin is admitting here is staggering. What drives his science is not facts but philosophy. His faith position predetermines his science, not the other way around. That is how many in our modern world live, most without even knowing it or thinking about it. Beyond that, however, philosophers point out the contradiction of the whole premise of purely naturalistic science as a philosophy, contending rightfully that the assumption that we can believe only what can be proven by scientific methods must be abandoned because that conviction itself cannot be proven by science. The faith which the positivists displayed in natural science, philosopher Nicholas Walterstorff argues, was not itself arrived at scientifically. So, shouldn't it be doubted? The fact of the matter is, we all have a faith position, an interpretation of reality that does not have definitive proof. This faith position exists for all of us to help frame reality and give life meaning, to answer our deepest questions regarding identity, environment, origins, and purpose. In their book, The Transforming Vision, Brian Walsh and J. Richard Middleton point this out, saying that everyone has a worldview, whether they realize it or not, and that it is the way we answer four basic questions. Who am I? Or what are the nature, task, and purposes of human beings? Where am I? Or what is the nature of the world and universe I live in? What's wrong? Or what is the basic problem or obstacle that keeps me from attaining fulfillment? In other words, how do I understand evil? And what is the remedy? Or how is it possible to overcome this hindrance to my fulfillment? In other words, how do I find salvation? We all have arrived at answers to these questions, even if many of us can't pinpoint the influences that came together to form our beliefs. Every construct of reality answers these questions differently. Compare how an atheist would answer them versus how a Buddhist would, for instance. But never, Walsh and Middleton say, are the answers merely a vision of life, but always a vision for life as well. And that is the tricky part. If we answer these big questions with an eye to the later first versus the former, we may influence that kind of truth we allow in. Alternate beliefs. Skepticism is itself a set of narrow-minded and dogmatic beliefs, a commitment to a lifestyle of consistent doubt, and choosing not to commit to any one belief about spiritual or ultimate things. Skeptics feel that they are being open-minded, but miss the inherent irony that to not commit to one set of beliefs about spiritual matters is itself a choice to commit to a set of beliefs about spiritual matters. The problem is that people often lack the self-awareness to recognize this contradiction. Secularism is a set of alternative doctrines and beliefs to theism, beliefs that have not been proven and substantiated enough to be taught as the only or exclusive way to think as a human being. Some thinkers go as far as to believe, as Sam Harris once wrote, that atheism is not a philosophy nor even a world view. It is simply an admission of the obvious. I have encountered this perspective 1,000 times in talking to atheists and agnostics in my life, and have done my best to point out how naive and blind it is. In this book, The Reason for God, Timothy Keller points out that doubts are simply a set of alternate beliefs. You cannot doubt an unprovable Christian belief, he wrote, except from a position of faith an unprovable non-Christian belief. Take, for instance, the skeptical doubt that Jesus Christ really rose from the dead. Why do people reject this? Because they already hold a prior belief that when people die, there is no coming back from the dead. This reflects the thinking that came out of the 17th century Enlightenment and continues to be the script most of us read from the cradle to the grave in the Western world. But a belief in the finality of death and a belief that nothing can defy the laws of nature are both unprovable conclusions. Interestingly, many non-Christian scholars believe miracles such as the resurrection are possible given certain recent scientific discoveries. For instance, the science of quantum mechanics has shown that some aspects of Newtonian physics, which have informed naturalistic assumptions for years, are fundamentally misguided. It turns out the universe is far more complex and connected than we once thought. Science itself has evolved and gone beyond the observational evidences of Newton and Darwin. Objection to supernatural activity has been shown to come from a rigid application of the modern worldview's definition of reality, which is but one of the large number of humanly constructed maps of reality. Impressive because of the degree of control it has given us, but it is no more an absolute map of reality than any of the previous maps. New developments in science show that the old constructs are ill-informed. This alone should cause any skeptic to be careful when making dogmatic statements about the impossibility of miracles. Concluding that miracles can't happen is not a neutral point of view. As New Testament scholar Craig Keener has pointed out, to rule out even asking questions about divine activity is not neutral, but an act of cultural hegemony. In other words, it is an accepted belief informed by powerful Western institutions that shape how we all think every day. We must all admit we have faith commitments, and we are all people of faith. The real question is, what is the context of my set of beliefs? And flowing from that, what is that content based on? And finally, is my faith position the most valid to hold if I were to carefully examine all the best available evidence?